I promise this is a video about a runestone. But first, let me show you a dumb little arts and crafts project that I did yesterday to make a point. If you're an American, or even if you're not, you probably recognize the top half of your screen as a facsimile of our 1776 Declaration of Independence. Cue the red-tailed hawk scream the television pretends is a bald eagle scream. Anyway, the bottom half is a poor man's scan of my own handwritten version of the same part of the Declaration of Independence that I made yesterday in 2020. Now, ignore the fact that my handwriting is not exactly normal for 2020. That almost makes it better because the medieval elements kind of make it look like I was trying to make it look older. And notice that you don't have to be a specialist in paleography or old writing to be able to tell that the style of the top half and the bottom half is completely different. You can point out specific things, like the fact that the S's are written differently, or the fact that many nouns are capitalized in the actual 1776 text that aren't capitalized today. But the bottom half, my handwritten 2020 Declaration of Independence, is still a better attempt at making a text look like it's from 1776 than the Kensington Runestone is at making a text look like it's actually a runestone from the Middle Ages. Now let me show you why. You know, when I was, I suppose, 10 years old in a little town close to here, I remember sneaking into a movie theater on July 4th, 1996 to see the movie Independence Day. It was my first, quote-unquote, grown-up movie. And I sat there marveling at the sight of huge alien spaceships soaring over all the major cities of the world. And it was kind of a thrilling experience for a 10-year-old, I suppose. But you know what? The whole time I sat there thinking, this looks really cool, it looks really impressive, but it never once occurred to me that to prove that it wasn't real, I would need to leave the theater and look up at the sky. And that is also my attitude toward the Kensington Runestone. It is so fake on the face of it that I have resisted talking about it on this channel for the going on 4 years that I've been making videos about Old Norse language and myth here. I remember in grad school I did take a look at the Kensington Runestone in photographs at one point just because so many people asked me about it even then. And I remember seeing the numbers, which are written in pentatic numerals, and knowing instantly that it was fake because the pentatic numerals weren't done right. This is actually the main criterion that Michael Barnes uses in his Runes, a handbook, one of the best English language resources for real good information about runes. He points out that the person writing this runestone clearly was thinking in Arabic numerals, the numerals that we largely use today, and trying to use the pentatic numerals as if they were Arabic numerals. Now, this is a fairly detailed sort of argument that I'm not going to make here, as what I want to focus on is just the really clear, obvious evidence that this runestone is a fake, which is internal to the inscription itself. The language is completely wrong. It's not the language of the 1300s when it's supposedly written. It looks much more like 19th or 20th century Swedish than like medieval Swedish or Norwegian. I'm sure there's also evidence you could take from the physical rock itself. I mean, you know, you can always date the rock and say, well, the rock is old. Well, you know, guess what? So is this rock. If I mean, this is good Rocky Mountain quartz. If a pretty piece, actually, that I just incidentally picked up. If I take some kind of chisel and put runes into this, even though I could do a much better job of making it look like real medieval Old Norse, like I did in Frozen. And the rock, of course, is presumably millions of years old, you still wouldn't date that inscription to millions of years ago or even 1,000 years ago unless you had good reason to do so, because it's such an extraordinary claim that you would find an Old Norse inscription in the middle of Colorado. And I don't need to examine the rock itself because the inscription itself is so transparently new. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. First of all, let's look at the rune shapes. The runes are sometimes more or less what you'd expect in, say, post-1000s runic inscriptions in Scandinavia, but often they're not. The A looks like an X, which you would never see this early. Now, some of these rune forms, George T. Flume, very early on, pointed out in his skeptical article about the Kensington Runestone, that some of these, including the A that looks like an X, like in Vinland in line 3, were in use in Dalarna in Sweden in the 1700s. Okay, but that's not in the 1300s, and inscriptions from the 1300s from anywhere in Scandinavia lack forms like this. One of the most transparent modern things is that the letters that Swedish today writes as A with a diaeresis, that's the two dots people often call umlaut, and O with a diaeresis, are written as runes with diaeresis. Now, this is not a medieval practice at all. In fact, even in the Roman alphabet, the alphabet that we still use today in Sweden in the 1300s, they weren't writing these letters that way. If you look at something like the Äldre Västgötalagen, you do see these so-called umlauted vowels written distinctly, but not with those two dots. Often the A is written something like the modern ash that you would see in actually Norwegian or Danish, and the O with a mark above it that looks almost perhaps like a little bit of a parasitical E coming off of it. Not with those two dots. And I've never seen those two dots put above a letter in a runic inscription anyway. That is a modern phenomenon. The V, which is kept distinct from the U, that itself is not a particularly medieval practice, but then the letter looks nothing like anything used for V in the Middle Ages. And then probably the most damning evidence that this is done by a person in the late 19th century who doesn't understand Old Norse or Old Swedish well is that the rune thorn, which stands for the th, or sometimes sound in Old Norse, is actually used both for where you would find that sound in Old Norse and for D. All the Ds are written like they're th. So in line 6, you have dag, day, written like it's thag. Now, again, George T. Flume points out that by the 1700s in Dalarna, there were some people writing this way. But well into the 1400s and even 1500s in Sweden and Norway, you would have people writing th distinct from duh because the sounds hadn't merged yet. What this looks like is somebody in the 19th century who knows that some of the Ds in Swedish or Norwegian come from earlier ths and ths, doesn't realize that not all of them do, and so writes all of them using this letter for a sound that's no longer in the language. It's much like somebody who is trying to sound smart today using all whom, not realizing that whom isn't just an older form of who, but actually an older, distinct grammatical case of who, that you don't replace who with whom always to make it look old or quote-unquote smart. So the rune shapes argue that this is done by someone in the late 19th century who maybe is familiar with the way runes are written in Dalarna in the early modern period, but I think just as likely simply doesn't understand runic orthography at all. We also see grammatical evidence against this being from the Old Norse period. The most powerful argument is simply that the singular form of verbs is used in the plural. Now, in the standard modern Scandinavian language, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, there is no longer plural inflection of the verb. You say, jeg har, vi har, I have, we have, and it's the same form of the verb. But still 100 years ago, for the most part, standard orthography in Scandinavia still called for a distinct plural, even though probably by the early modern period, a lot of dialects had transitioned to simply singular marking. And in the 20th century, all of the Scandinavian norms turned to accepting only the singular form of the verb, as in the spoken language. Swedish was the last holdout. There's still people writing distinct plural verbs in the 1950s. So when we see vi hade in line 4, vi var in line 6, vi kom in line 7, with vi used with singular forms of the verb, that would look, it's very modern. It looks like today's Norwegian or Swedish. It looks like probably 100 years ago vernacular Swedish or Norwegian, but it looks like it looks like someone carved LOL or WTF in the 1300s. It's that out of place. Nobody wrote like this. I'm sure nobody spoke like this in the 1300s. These forms were well in the future. Now, you could argue, as I believe some specialists in Italian have, that there might have been unknown dialects of Norwegian or Swedish that had already made these innovations in the 1300s. Okay, why would they be in Minnesota? You know, if you've made some kind of grand journey, as the stone argues that 8 men from Jutland and 22 Norwegians had, to the middle of North America, would you write in your obscure, difficult for your compatriots to understand dialect? I find that hard to believe. I think you would use the most standard language for your time, probably even a fairly conservative language for your time, which this isn't. This looks ludicrously modern, even from the perspective of something like the 1500s New Testament from Sweden. There's also the complete absence of the dative. In line 3, we see Fro Vinland. Line 4, ved, number 2, skär. Line 5, Fro Dennostein. Line 10, ve havet. Line 11, after vor skip. Each of these lines, we would expect the noun to be written with a distinct dative case marking. The dative was still thoroughly in use in the 1500s in Swedish and Norwegian. I see no reason to think there'd be a dialect in the 1300s that wouldn't have it. Ludicrous. There's vocabulary that's too modern. Oppdagelse in line 2 for discovery, resa for journey in lines 5 and 11. These are words you wouldn't expect in early modern Norwegian or Swedish. These don't come in until well after German influence has leaked deeply into Norwegian and Swedish centuries later. Ludicrous that these words would be present in the 1300s. They're absent, again, even in the 1500s, New Testament in Swedish. I would think, I'm not going to get into the pentatic numerals argument. If you want to learn more about that, look at Michael Barnes' Runes, a Handbook. It's too into the weeds. But just a quick remark about the numbers. Typically in runic inscriptions, they wrote numbers out. So in other words, you wouldn't expect a symbol for the number 2, you'd expect the word 2. Just the fact that they're not written out is kind of ridiculous. If they weren't written out, if there were any kind of symbol used, I would expect to see Roman numerals, if anything. But I would really expect the numbers to be written out, not these pentatic numerals that look like they were translated by someone who's thinking in Arabic numerals. And as George T. Flume points out, the narrative is too detailed. When you look at inscriptions left, even at places of great distant exploration, let's take the Kingi Torsuak runestone from the early 1300s, so a supposed contemporary of the Kensington Runestone. This is from 72 degrees north on the west side of Greenland. Now the Arctic Circle is at about 66 degrees north. This is the furthest north that I believe we can document that the Norse ever went. It's an amazing monument to an amazing journey of discovery and exploration. What does that runestone say? And this we can tell is genuine. The language is exactly what we would expect in the 1300s. The runes are exactly what we'd expect in the 1300s. Erlingur Sigvarssonar och Barni Þórðarson och Einriði Ósson laugardagen fyrir gakkendag hlóðu varða þessa och riðu, and then a couple symbols we can't read. That means Erling, son of Sigvad, and Borni, son of Thorður, and Einrið, the son of Os, on the Saturday before, and I believe Gakkendag is Rogation Day, although I don't know my Catholic calendar very well, loaded up these piles of stones and cleared, and then we have the lines, the letters we don't understand, or the symbols we don't understand. This is very concise. It does not have the long narrative style of the Kensington Runestone, and the date, such as it's given, is not a year. Actually, if there were a year at all, we wouldn't expect it to be given in a calendar year. We'd expect it to be given as the 5th year of the reign of so-and-so anyway. But the date is given as a day of the year, the Saturday before Rogation Day, not as 1362 or what have you. It's not real. I don't know what else to tell you now. Look at actual 1300s documents in runes or in the Roman alphabet from Scandinavia. Look at, or areas of Scandinavian exploration. Look at the Kingi Torsuak runestone from Greenland. Look at Kunglige Biblioteket manuscript B59, which is a 1300-ish manuscript of Aldra Vastjytelagen, the older laws of Vastjytland, where supposedly 8 of the men in the party of the Kensington Runestone were from. And you will see a much, much more conservative, much more archaic stage of the language than the Kensington Runestone supposedly represents. The stone is transparently the work of someone in the late 19th century when it was discovered who is thinking in modern Swedish or a dialect of modern Swedish or Norwegian, trying to make it look a little bit older, using runes that are at best, if we're being generous, reflective of 1700s practice, and trying to pass it off as a monument to Norse exploration in the New World in the 1300s. Now, this was a time when people were just beginning to think that maybe the Vikings had gotten to North America, and now we know that they did. We have strong archaeological evidence for their presence in Newfoundland at the Lanso Meadow site, discovered and excavated in the 1960s by the Ingstas. We have pretty decent evidence from the Sagas. Now keep in mind that the Sagas about exploration in North America, the so-called Vinland Sagas, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, are written at best third hand. They're generations after the actual explorers. And also keep in mind that people writing sagas aren't necessarily the navigators. Just like today, the people writing novels aren't necessarily the people who are going out and doing the kinds of things described in their novels. But we can still read out of it with some fair confidence about the North American continent they're exploring. Although it's difficult to say exactly where they're going, it's possible that they went a good ways down the Gulf of St. Lawrence, so perhaps as far as Claysemont, the city of Quebec. But they're not going to Minnesota. I would be very, very surprised if any of them ever got that far. I mean, a little ways down the Atlantic seaboard, a ways down the St. Lawrence, plausible from the descriptions in the sagas and from where we knew they were in Newfoundland. Minnesota is way far, and the 1360s is pretty late. I mean, the settlement in Greenland had already turned in on itself quite a bit. I wouldn't expect Swedish and Norwegians, which are what the text of the Kensington Runestone identifies the party traveling as, to be out there. I'd expect Greenlanders, if anything. I don't know if anybody identified as a Geet, a Jytte, someone from Jytteland rather than just a Swede in the 1300s. It just doesn't make sense. It's worse than my 2020 attempt to remake the 1776 Declaration of Independence on a piece of printer paper. And I don't say that because I don't want it to be true. I think it would be a lot of fun if there were Vikings in Minnesota or Colorado in the 1300s, right? That'd be great. There's a guy 10 miles from here who tells me he has runes in a cave, but he wants to charge me $20 to look at them. I'm not going to pay him the $20, right? If you have some kind of claim that on the face of it is pretty tough to believe, like there's aliens above you in the sky, or that there were Vikings writing runestones at the 1300s in Minnesota, you are the one who has to sustain the burden of the proof. And maybe you'll prove something incredible happened that the rest of us simply don't suspect. But the Kensington Runestone does not prove what it sets out to prove any better than a bunch of deer meat and a gorilla costume and a freezer proves that Bigfoot is walking around. All right, well, stay tuned after my commercial break here, and I'm going to show you what the text of the Kensington Runestone looks like, transliterated into the Roman alphabet, and what it would look like if it actually were written in Old Swedish or Old Norse. Let's take a look at that after a word from my sponsor. Now let's take a close look at the text of the Kensington Runestone, transliterated into the Roman alphabet in the top left of your screen there, and compare it to what the same text, using the same words, would look like in modern Swedish. That's at the top center. Now that is a translation by me into everyday Swedish of today. Below that is modern Norwegian. I've chosen to use radical bokmål because the text is a little bit more like bokmål in the Kensington Runestone than it would be like Nynorsk, but I've used radical bokmål. In the top right is a very approximate idea of what the text would look like in Old Swedish in the 1300s or so. Now, I've been reading quite a bit in Old Swedish from the 1300s, from the 1500s. I've tried to lean toward forms that look more like those on the Kensington Runestone, but it's not a very good match at all. And then on the bottom right, for comparison's sake, is classical Old Norse, which is to say Old Norwegian or Old Icelandic. That's late 1200s, early 1300s forms, say, so roughly contemporary with when the Kensington Runestone is supposed to be from. Now, I've put a lot of the words and all of the numbers in the Kensington inscription at the top left in parentheses, and what's parenthesized is numbers because they're not written out, so there's no way that the words for the numbers in these different languages would help us one way or the other, and it would take up a lot of space in a fairly crowded presentation. And then words are in parentheses if in one or more of the comparanda languages, there's just no way to use the same word or a cognate word. The first place you see that is in line 2 of the Kensington inscription, Oppdagelsesferd. Oppdagelse is only a word in Norwegian. So there's no Swedish cognate that I've ever run into. It is a borrowing from German made in the early or mid-modern period, so there's no cognate in Old Swedish or Old Norse, so that word is left out. But then in the same way, I've left out words if there's just not a cognate in that language, or if the word just can't be used that way in that language. For instance, the way that the Kensington Runestone uses west or vest in line 3, you just wouldn't use directional terms that way in Old Swedish or Old Norse. You wouldn't say from the west, you would say vestan, which is its own simple word. So just from that, you can tell that the person who wrote the Kensington Runestone didn't really understand the idioms of Old Swedish or Old Norse. But let's take a closer look at that. Now, it's pretty weird to think that in 1362, as the Kensington Runestone is supposedly dated from, someone would be writing a form of what we've got to call Swedish, really. I mean, there's several things that are distinctly Swedish. If you look in line 1, Norrman, without the D or eth there, that's a Swedish sound change. It's not really exactly Swedish. It's got a lot of features that are more Norwegian. For example, the use of schwa indicated by E, and a lot of endings like yetter in line 1, or let's see, frausa in the fourth line from the bottom. That's more Norwegian. Now, it's been argued that maybe what this could represent would be a dialect of Swedish, and I think that's a fair argument. It's been made very early on. It was made by George C. Flume. But of course, then that's not a medieval dialect. It's a modern Swedish dialect. I think that's potentially the case, that what we're looking at is that the inscriber in the late 19th century spoke a Swedish dialect that was a little bit different from standard Swedish, had some commonalities with Norwegian, or he was a Swedish speaker who had a lot of contact with Norwegian speakers. That's certainly possible too. Or just a Swedish speaker who thought, for whatever arbitrary reason, that Norwegian was more archaic than Swedish, which really isn't true in its standard form. And so mixed in some Norwegian items with Swedish items. It's hard to say. But this is in no way a medieval dialect. I mean, this is modern Scandinavian, whether Swedish or Norwegian. There's no plural inflection of the verb. So, for example, you look in line 6, vivar, line 7, vicom. No one wrote that way in Sweden or Norway till, 100 years ago. That was still a fairly new thing. Now, people were pronouncing it that way probably by 200, 300 years ago. But the standard written languages preserved the difference between singular and plural. In the case of Swedish, into the mid-20th century, there were people writing after World War II who wrote more archaic Swedish than what's in the Kensington Runestone. Notice, too, that the personal endings would have still been preserved in the 1300s anywhere in Sweden or Norway or Iceland or Greenland. Of course, I'm using Swedish as my main example because the text looks so Swedish. It's weird that in line 1 it mentions 8 Geats, or men from Jytteland, and 22 Norwegians. Of course, I don't know if anybody still identified as a Geat or Jyttelandish person rather than just a Swede. I would doubt it. I don't know why you would have people who still identified with their home countries over in Minnesota in the 1300s when presumably their place of starting would be Greenland. Anyway. So in the 1300s in Swedish or Old Norse, Old Icelandic, Old Norwegian, you would still have distinct first-person plural forms. Again, if we look at line 6, line 7, where the Kensington Stone says vivar, vicom, of course, those are perfect in modern Swedish or modern Norwegian. But in Old Swedish, we'd expect vivarum, vicomum. Similarly, in Old Norse, vervorum, verkomum. We would want to see those ums there. There is no evidence that at this time, anywhere in the Scandinavian-speaking world, maybe Denmark, you would not have a distinction between singular and plural. In any dialect of Swedish or Norwegian, I would still expect to see the first-person plural there. If you look at the Swedish of the New Testament translation of 1526, it still has archaic features that aren't in the Kensington Runestone. All right. I have colored text in red in the comparanda samples if I think that it is particularly similar to the Kensington Stone. Notice how much of it is more similar to Swedish. Of course, the spelling hada in line 4 without the extra D you'd expect for Norwegian. Läger for camp. That is a Swedish word, and in particular a modern Swedish word. No equivalent in Old Swedish or Old Norse. Dagsrisa in line 5, the Kensington inscription, doesn't look exactly like how you would put that in any modern Scandinavian language. That use of resa, reisa for journey is not present in the Middle Ages, so I haven't included it in the Old Swedish or Old Norse. I think it looks just a little bit more like the Swedish word, but that's just an arbitrary feeling because it's not, I don't know, it could be the inscriber's Swedish dialectical form. Norr från denna sten, for north from this stone, looks more Swedish. Certainly in Norwegian, you'd expect the diphthong. The Kensington inscriber has monophthongal pronunciations that looks like Eastern Norwegian or Swedish again. Also in Norwegian, I'd really expect denna steinen. You could expect that in Swedish too, but for sure in Norwegian. Anyway, looks a little more Swedish. The expression påfiske, at fishing, you couldn't say it that way in Old Swedish or Old Norse. It is a firmly modern Swedish or modern Norwegian form. In fact, you may notice the only thing that I have colored red in Old Swedish is the spelling dag with D-A-G-H. it wouldn't be hard for someone who in the 19th century became familiar with runes from a book and maybe had a sense of what looked old in Swedish to supply that spelling to make it look a little bit older, although it certainly doesn't make it look 1300s when everything else looks very 19th century. The spelling PT and after looks like Old Norse, Old Icelandic, Old Norwegian, which is weird, but it's very out of place again with all the otherwise 19th century features here. We came back, we found 10 men, red from blood and dead. You know, this is one of those things that I think is funny because, and I'm looking at, let's see, that's line 7, 8 now. So, vi kom hem fann probably 10 män röda, blue, och dead. I guess how I'd read out the Kensington inscription there. We came home, found 10 men, red from blood and dead. If you are on the run from people who killed 10 of your guys, why do you not just say 10 men dead? Why do you have to add the weird poetic flourish, red with blood? I don't know. I mean, the whole thing is much longer than any runic inscription would realistically be recording any event. Anyway, it's odd in particular that in line 8, dead is written just like, I mean, it looks like it evokes the English word dead, right? In Old Norse, you'd expect död with the diphthong. In Old Swedish, död. Modern Swedish död. Modern Norwegian död. The dead certainly could be Swedish dialect. George T. Flume did point out that there are Swedish dialects where you've got dead instead of dead. Okay, but probably the weirdest thing is that there's no plural inflection on that adjective. Notice that in the above line, röd is inflected plural, röda. You would expect döda too. This looks like somebody who's maybe thinking in English and doesn't fully understand Scandinavian inflection, or maybe has a native speaker, heritage speaker's intuition's a little bit clouded by speaking English for a long time, like somebody in Minnesota in the late 1800s. Frausa of Ilu, certainly probably the most archaic looking line in the whole Kensington inscription. That of Ilu with the dative marking on Ilu does look old, but it wouldn't be that hard to learn. A phrase such as Frausa av Ilu, in Old Swedish, Frausa av Ilu in Old Norse. It's weird that this is the only place where we see a dative ending. For instance, in the line above, av blod, you'd expect that to have a dative ending too. Av blode, av bloody, something like that. It's out of place. This is another place where George C. Flume thought that maybe the speaker was getting it from his modern Swedish dialect. Har, I'm going to take this as something like we have 10 men at the sea. Har 10 mans vi havet. In Old Swedish or Old Norse, this would look very different. Havum or hovum. Har is the modern Swedish or modern Norwegian form. In the late 1800s, you wouldn't even write it this way. You would have written it still as hava and giving it a plural inflection. So again, we have influence from the inscriber's spoken Swedish or East Norwegian dialect. And it looks, from a Swedish perspective, this still looks, again, later than the 19th century. It looks like the 20th century because in the 19th century, you still would have written this hava with a plural inflection. What the S is doing at the end of man there is an open question. There's nowhere in the Middle Ages or modern period where in Scandinavian you would count man, mans. That S is not a plural ending in Scandinavia. So that could be English influence. It could be, I mean, even though in English we don't have an S there in the plural either. I don't know what's going on with that S. It's very weird. Then ve havet, that looks like the Norwegian form ve. I guess there could be Swedish dialects on the western side that would have the ve sound instead of the v sound as you find in Swedish today. Anyway, it's sloppy.
I'd say after vote skip, I'm not the first and I won't be the last to point out that I'd say after to look after is a modern idiom indeed, also an English idiom. You wouldn't say this in Old Swedish or Old Norse, but it's easy enough to translate. So I'd say after in Old Swedish, I'd sjå after in Old Norse, but then we'd expect a dative here again. And once again, the speaker doesn't know where to put the dative. So we got våra ship, which is another place where the vowels just look a lot more Norwegian than Swedish. But anyway, in Old Swedish or Old Norse, expect vorum skipum. Then we got another number, another compound that just, I'm not even going to bother with this in Old Swedish and Old Norse, and even in modern Swedish and Norwegian, it contradicts the way that he spells it in line 5, where he's got the genitive form of the first word. And then that very last word, from, very last line, the first word, from, this is clearly the English word. Right, again, just like in dead, 4 lines above that, we've got some English influence. In modern Swedish, you could expect an in there. I can't think of any dialects, never run across a dialect of Swedish where there's an M there. Potentially, this person knew that in Old Norse or in modern Norwegian there is a word fram, forth. Maybe he thought that that was a more archaic form of frå. People often think that longer forms of words are older than shorter ones. Witness the way people overuse whom instead of who to sound smart in English. Anyway, hard to say exactly what's going on or why. He decides that dino in this last line, just like in line 5 up there, is what comes after fro or from. I mean, it doesn't even look like a dative form in Old Norse or Old Swedish where we'd expect thessi here and thessum before steni or stena. And then spelled with an H at the end. That is a convention you see sometimes in early to mid modern Swedish in words that end in a vowel, especially a long vowel such as this, the word for island, that is influenced by German spelling. You never see that in the Middle Ages, and certainly would not see it in Old Swedish or Old Norse. And you see the same thing there in R. Why spell that AHR? I don't know. I would expect, if anything, to see maybe a doubled A, but really in runes I would expect just an A for or, the year. And then, of course, we have the problem that, you rarely see years in runic inscriptions. When you do, you're more likely to see something like in the 5th year of the reign of so-and-so, not a year of the Common Era or Anno Domini. This is just, it's strange up and down. And of course, the pentatic numerals are used wrong. It's just poorly done. A little bit creatively done. I mean, I don't want to necessarily cast aspersions on the intelligence of the person who did this. There's some mild cleverness to it, but it looks nothing like Old Swedish. I mean, take a look at any line of more than a word in the Old Swedish and compare it to the Kensington Runestone, and that Old Swedish would still be pretty passable in the 1500s, based on my reading of 1500s Old Swedish, especially in the 1526 New Testament translation, which is pretty conservative Swedish for its time. I mean, that 1500s Old Swedish still looks more archaic than the Kensington Runestone. 1950s Swedish still looks more archaic than the Kensington Runestone. It is a fake. It is kind of funny, kind of clever in moments maybe, but it is not from 1362. And the very fact that it says it's from 1362 is maybe the best proof in combination with how many words simply betray their origins in the Swedish of a Swedish immigrant to America in the late 1800s.
Well, folks, I hope this has been an interesting or informative look at this for you, and although I'm probably now banned for life from the state of Minnesota, look what I've got to make up for it. One last thing. I hope that if you've enjoyed this video that you'll check out the more than 300 other videos about topics in Norse language and myth and other linguistic stuff on my channel. I hope you'll check out my translations. I work on the most important primary sources of Norse mythology, translating them into contemporary English that anyone can enjoy. Most recently, I've published with Hackett Publishing Company, The Wanderer's Havamal, a dual language text of that important text of Odin's council. And also, the whole point of this video channel, the whole point of my books, is to bring good information about these subjects to the people who want it in the places where they're looking for it online. Otherwise, the people who know what they're talking about are all trying to impress each other, talking to each other in the ivory tower, and they're never reaching out to the public. The people who are reaching out to the public on YouTube or wherever else mostly are scared, angry people trying to spread centuries-old, cartoonish racialist theories and crazy mysticism that has nothing to do with our medieval sources. I want to bring good information about our real medieval sources straight to you in the places where you're looking for it, without an agenda, without trying to set myself up as some ivory tower super genius who's better than you. You can help me do that by donating small monthly amounts on my Patreon. And everyone who does that has my everlasting thanks for your incredible generosity and the way that you help me make a university of my favorite place in the world, the Great Rocky Mountain Outdoors. Well, from the middle of beautiful Colorado, let me wish you good thinking, good skepticism, and all the very best.